Hello.
Okay, so I want you to appreciate the fact that an ecosystem is not just the living organisms, not just the plants and the critters that exist in a particular area, but it is them as well as the non-living parts, or what we call the abiotic parts of that area and ecosystem that they interact with as well. As a matter of fact, an ecosystem is built around the physical factors that exist there in the first place. The primarily water, temperature, sunlight, etc. There's a whole lot of them, as we'll go into right here. From there, you typically have the basis of the food chain, your producers, that are adapted to a particular set of physical conditions, and then from there, you have the food chain going on up with your consumers and eventually your decomposers, and those organisms are adapted both to the physical conditions that are there, as well as the other organisms that are in the environment. So everybody should be off your phones, paying attention, please. And so what we see is a hierarchy. In other words, from larger collection to smaller. The biosphere, this is our fourth sphere, as I mentioned. This is basically all of the ecosystems of the Earth connected together, and they are. No ecosystem exists on its own. As a matter of fact, defining what is an ecosystem can sometimes, be just basically up to the observer to say, this is a particular, what we want to define as an ecosystem. But you always have movement into and out of those ecosystems by organisms, or maybe they're products of those ecosystems and things, the way they change the water chemistry and stuff, that's going to affect other ecosystems as well. So none of them are isolated, and they're all affected by each other. So consequently, all those ecosystems together of the Earth come together to form what we call the biosphere, the living part of the Earth. But the biosphere does include the physical parts of the Earth, the other three spheres, specifically where they're being acted upon or by the organisms. So that's what your biosphere is. It's broken into ecosystems. Once again, ecosystems living in non-living parts, biotic and abiotic parts. If you take out all of the abiotic, the physical parts, oops. That's on tape. I'll have to edit that. I didn't say it on purpose, by the way. You have what's known as the community. Community.
How are you going to edit that out?
Okay, so you can think of this as, within a city, you have this physical structures of the city and everything itself, but the people of that city make up that community. Okay, and we assume with the community that all the parts of the community, and this is what we call the populations, that they interact with each other. Okay, and so the next step down is that community is made up of different populations of different organisms. Each population is of a single species. It's something we call a breeding unit.
Breeding.
Yes, breeding. Yeah, we'll get to sex later, but so that is what defines a species in particular, is the fact that it can reproduce. A population, that designation is important, of course, because the way that that's how a population continues itself on is through reproduction, and the effects of the environment. A large part of that has a lot of influence on what happens with reproduction and this also shows us where another thing that we tend to associate with population. What do we oftentimes associate with population, just besides it, rather than it being just a group? We also oftentimes use it as a instead of a name of something, but a. So when we say the U.S. population is, what would you think? A lot, which means it's a number, right?
Oh, never mind.
So we oftentimes associate with population, we associate a number, which is typically of a particular population, the number of those organisms. So that's, of course, an important characteristic of that group. But they're all the same species, so they can interbreed and everything, and therefore those population numbers are going to be affected by that. And then, of course, you have the individual organisms that make up that environment lastly. And you could continue to go on. You'll see in some illustrations where it shows you the hierarchy where it goes all the way down to atom. That's kind of obvious, but you know that's there as well. But we'll stick to these 5 different levels in the hierarchy. Okay. Now, the abiotic factors. This is not all-inclusive. There's a number of different things. pH is good. That's actually not one of the ones I chose to list, so that's okay. But group 4, you definitely get the point for it. Probably the most important one, as you might be well aware, is water. The amount of water available. Okay. In a terrestrial ecosystem, of course. Of course, this is not a factor typically in an aquatic ecosystem, unless maybe it's a wetland, which is sometimes wet, sometimes dry. But in the open ocean, you have no shortage of water. Then other factors become more of a...
Water's already.
Oh, is it? Oh, somebody already put that there. So they'll get the point as well.
Woo!
Okay.
When in doubt.
And another thing, like I said, I want to point out that this is not all inclusive. Some of these are more of a factor, obviously, in aquatic or marine ecosystems. Water is not a limiting factor in a marine ecosystem, so we don't really think of it as one of the abiotic factors. So some of them are actual materials. Some of them are levels, like the temperature. You know, some of them are forms of energy, like the sunlight. So any of these non-living things that will affect an organism in a particular environment, then those are the abiotic factors of that environment. And as I mentioned, you tend to build your environment from there. So you've got different types of organisms that through natural selection, which we'll look at more in detail later, you end up in an environment having organisms that are best adapted to that environment. In other words, their range of tolerance, sorry, not level, fits in well.
What?
Range.
Okay.
That's a weird. Let me fix that. Their range of tolerance fits in well with the normal physical ranges of that environment. Is it cold? Is it hot? Is it dry? Is it wet? Is it salty? Is a lot of sunlight? Not much sunlight? So all those things are factors that build into that. So some things can, and I've talked about this a little bit before. We talked about how when you, for example, pollute a lake, let's say you make it eutrophic, and how it's not actually less productive, and we'll look at what productivity means in a minute. It's not really less productive so much because you've got a lot of algae and bacteria that are doing a lot of photosynthesis, and a lot of biology is actually going on in that lake, but it is very low in biodiversity because you've selected out for only a small number of organisms that have a range of tolerance that can handle those conditions. Okay. So that's how that affects. It's affected that by the environment. And then your biotic factors. So where's your abiotic factors are those things in the environment, those non-living things in the environment that affect an organism. Your biotic factors are going to be those living things in an organism that affects the in-case study organism we're talking about. Those other living things around, what do organisms rely upon other organisms in the environment for? And of course the main one is, no, it's too big. I'm not going to give you a point for that. Sorry, group one. What's the main thing we use other organisms for? Food. Yeah. Everything you eat was an organism. We do not eat rocks, typically. Yeah, I mean salt, and you could say salt has some nutritive value. Really, when we look at minerals, though, we typically, to be a food, it really needs to have some energy value, and salt does not. So food's a big one there, of course. Obviously, one of the big driving forces in an ecosystem, the relationships there, predator-prey, and parasitism, and all that other kind of stuff. Shelter, not nearly as much of a concern or value as food, but is very crucial in many cases. In particular organisms, i.e. trees and coral, that's their main function in an ecosystem. You get these big, huge trees in the rainforest. A lot of it is edible, but a lot of that tree there, that biomass in that tree is not edible. It's locked away. It's not part of the food chain. So in that way, it does not contribute to the rest of the environment. But the ability for many, many different things to live in there, to find shelter and stuff like that is a crucial factor for that. Now, shelter is less derived, for us it's more of a matter of comfort. Shelter in this case is more of a matter of protection, as well as not only just protection from your enemies, but it's also used by the predators as a place to lurk, to hide, to try to find their prey, etc. So it's a big factor in a lot of ecosystems. And population control. Now, this is the one that you would think of. If you're that individual that's getting controlled, i.e. killed, you think, hey, this is not such a good thing. Why would my species want this? But the fact is that all species reproduce at a rate that is greater than the environment can handle. That's part of the natural selection process. As a matter of fact, that idea was one of the things that Darwin formed a lot of his theory around, because a guy named Malthus saw this. He noticed that in any given population that many of the offspring end up dying, sadly, but true. Nature is cruel. So that's a necessary thing. Not only, of course, does it keep a population from using up the physical resources, which is disaster for an ecosystem, for everybody in that, but also it plays a role in natural selection, because much of the time those things are getting preyed upon, or those things are susceptible to disease, which is another type of this population control, are the weaker individuals in the environment and the population, and therefore they won't pass those weaker genes on. So there you go. Any questions about some of the basic parts of an ecosystem? No? Good to go? Okay.